very exciting. This is my first talk at EUC since deciding to go to Riverside. So looking forward to lots of interactions with people. I just want to start by some acknowledgments. Doing research on bilingualism in central Pennsylvania is a challenge, and the way you do it is by having a lot of wonderful collaborators in different places in the world where bilingualism is more prevalent and where it takes different forms, and acknowledge the very generous support of a number of different grants, and particularly a grant from the National Science Foundation for partnerships in international research and education that has allowed us to create an international network of researchers interested in second language learning and bilingualism throughout the world. And I've been talking to people today about this, and I'm very interested in talking more about it because we're moving into a phase of beginning to do translational research, and are really looking for input and advice from those of you who've been doing translational research. Okay, so on the 125th anniversary of the journal Science, Kennedy and Norman wrote an editorial in which they identified really the sort of top topics they thought should be the focus of research in the next 25 years in all of science. And one of those was the biological basis of second language learning. And again, it's really quite remarkable because this is in all of science, not just in cognitive science. And the data that are shown here are just a little snippet of data from Web of Science that show the tremendous growth of research on these topics just in the last decade or so. The next slide is a slightly more up-to-date version of these data. The graph on the left are Web of Science data on papers published on the topic of bilingualism. The data on the right are data on citations of those papers. And what you can see is that there's been a very marked rise in research on these topics. So it's reasonable at this moment to then say, what have we learned? And I'm going to argue today that we've learned a lot. We still have a lot to learn. We've learned that, especially from recent neuroscience evidence, that the evidence really calls into question the issue of presence of hard constraints on second language learning. Until recently, the traditional story in linguistics and psycholinguistics was that there were critical periods, that it was really, if you didn't get exposed to a second language before you were 5 years old, it was basically all over, and you could learn something of the second language, but not much. And the entire assumption about hard constraints has really been called into question, in large part because of the recent neuroscience evidence. And a second part of this evidence is that we've learned that sometimes the brain outpaces behavior in revealing aspects of second language learning. And so we need to really understand when that happens and what it means. We've also learned that there are consequences of bilingualism. So proficient bilinguals are not, in fact, monolingual-like in their native language, suggesting that the native language itself is open to change and to the influence of the second language. And the hypothesis here is that competition across the two languages reshapes the networks that support each of the languages, and we need to understand that process in some detail. So I'm going to organize my talk around what I'm calling 3 discoveries about bilingualism. And we wrote a paper in 2014 for Current Directions in Psychological Science in which we briefly review these arguments, and I'm going to try to bring them up to date today a bit and elaborate. So the 3 discoveries are, first, that both languages are always active. And this is very counterintuitive to people because, in fact, many of you are bilingual. It's very rare that a bilingual will inadvertently slip into the wrong language. Bilinguals are very good at speaking the language they intend to speak. At the same time, they may actively code switch with another person who's similarly bilingual, suggesting that both languages are available at the same time. And so what we need to understand is if the 2 languages are not separate, and certainly all of the recent imaging data suggests they're sitting in the same place, we need to understand how it's possible that bilinguals could have both languages active and yet fail to make inadvertent slips of the tongue in the way that they do. The second discovery is that as I mentioned a moment ago, the native language changes. And this is something that's really more of a sort of radical claim, because the assumption's always been that the native language is stable, and it's a little scary to think that your native language may not be stable and may change. But that what we see is that the native language changes in response to second language learning and in response to the context of second language use. And we need to understand how those changes occur. And what we're going to look at in a little bit later in the talk is what the implications that might hold for adult second language learners, where the goal is not to become a monolingual-like native speaker of the second language, but to become a bilingual-like speaker of that language. And finally, there is a lot of evidence now that there are consequences of bilingualism that extend beyond language, that extend to the reorganization of brain networks that hold implications for executive function, for attention, and that understanding the way that bilinguals negotiate competition across the two languages more generally may hold implications for how the system is tuned to be able to support language itself. So bilingualism itself has consequences for the mind and brain. And as Chris said in his very generous introduction, the view that I have is that bilingualism is very interesting in its own right, and there's no question about that. But that we really study bilingualism because bilingualism provides a tool, a lens for investigating the way language is supported, the intersections between language and cognition as a single system in a way that's very hard to see in individuals who speak one language alone. Okay, so what I'm going to do is very quickly try to review some evidence to really convince you of these three discoveries, and then try to focus at the end of my talk, really to focus more on the consequences of bilingualism and some of the recent discussion, some of which has been contentious, about what these results really mean. Okay, so the first observation is that both languages are always active and competing, and the slide I have for this and the phrase that I've been using as a metaphor is that the bilingual is a mental juggler. And so this is a picture of, not to offend anyone in the audience who's a Dutch-English bilingual, but this is meant to be an example of how if you're, for example, a Dutch-English bilingual and you're faced with a very, very simple task of naming this object, which next to, I don't know, tulips are probably the most common objects in the Netherlands. You have choices. I mean, and in the Netherlands, people are typically more than bilingual. They're often multilingual. But you could call this fiets, which is how you say bike in Dutch, or you could say bike. And the point is that even for something as simple and a task that could be performed by a 3-year-old child, every single time you confront that object, to the extent that both languages are active, you're making a decision. And that decision process, that selection process, may really be crucial in this tuning process of the cognitive mechanisms that underlie language use. So the question is, how does a bilingual select? And what we see is we see cross-language interactions at every level we look. These are persistent interactions. They've been documented, and I'm not going to go through all of this evidence, but at the lexical level, we see that even when bilinguals are processing words in sentence context, they seem to activate both language alternatives. And even if bilinguals are proficient, people used to think it was really a matter of proficiency, that if you're a learner, well, if you're a learner and you enter, your first Spanish class, of course your English is going to be active. It's the only language you have. And so the idea that the English would affect the Spanish is not such a terrible surprise. But what we might not expect is we might not expect that to continue when someone is proficient. And what we now know is even highly, highly proficient bilinguals are activating both language alternatives. Let me also, just one caveat before I go on, which is to say I haven't said who's bilingual here. And in the historical, traditional world of linguistics, bilinguals were only early bilinguals who were exposed to the two languages from birth and who were balanced. Well, number one, there are no balanced bilinguals. Okay, it's not, balance is is really a deceptive term. And we take bilingual to be anyone who actively uses the two languages at some level of proficiency. And there's going to be some ambiguity here because there are people who are quite advanced learners who by some claims would be bilingual, you would consider bilingual, but they're still dominant in their native language. Other people who would then categorize them as learners and a type of learner. So I'm a cognitive psychologist. I'm not going to worry about those fights too much. And we're just going to take anybody who uses both languages actively to be some form of bilingual, and we're going to acknowledge the idea that bilingualism isn't one thing, and so in fact these may all be different types of bilinguals. One of the results that's very, very striking is that we see this co-activation of the two languages, even when the languages look nothing like one another. So this Merced study that I'm not going to describe in detail today is a study of deaf readers, showing that when deaf readers read English, they implicitly activate the translations of those words in sign language. Now, sign language and English bear no superficial resemblance to one another, suggesting that this isn't just about languages like English and Spanish or English and Dutch that have some resemblance that you can, if you know one language, you can sort of read the other language to some degree. This seems to be a feature of bilingualism that's much more abstract and much more pervasive. We see these effects at the grammar, and I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. We also see them at the level of the phonology. And so we see these interactions between how speech is produced and perceived across the two languages. I'm going to illustrate this with a recent study that we published. And actually, this was inspired by Kellow, Plowton, McWhinney, which is what, 1999, I want to say, something like that? Okay, so they had published a paper claiming that sometimes you see competition in production that spills over into articulation. And what was really interesting, and it's been debated in the literature, but what was interesting to us is we think, well, second language learners may have no choice but to have activation into articulation, because oftentimes you have to speak, and you may not really be ready to speak. And so we were interested in looking at the extent to which we could see in the phonetics of speech, we could see evidence of interaction between the two languages. So we did something very, very simple. We asked 3 groups of learners. One were classroom learners in a kind of pathetic central Pennsylvania university classroom learning Spanish. They had not been immersed in Spanish. They were just in an English environment. We asked them to simply name words aloud on a screen that were in Spanish. And sometimes the words were cognates, words like actor, actor, tomato, tomato. And another group were similar kind of intermediate learners of Spanish, but they were immersed in a domestic immersion program. I don't know how many of you had experience in domestic immersion. If you go abroad to another country, you can often speak English, even you can sneak it in, right? You can speak English to other English speakers. In a domestic immersion program, this took place at Middlebury College, you have to sign a contract that says, you know, your tongue will be cut off if you speak English. And so it's really forced immersion and inhibition of your native language. And then we had a group of advanced, they were actually graduate teaching assistants in the Spanish department. We just asked everyone to name these words in Spanish, and they were cognates. And what we found is that everyone was faster to name the cognates than to name matched controls. Very nice result, replicates lots of findings in the literature. We find these kinds of cross-language effects all the time. The phonology and the form of the word converges in Spanish and English. You're faster to name it. And it's notable here that it's really pretty much the same effect for everyone. Notice that the immersed learners at Middlebury are actually faster than everybody else. This is to speak Spanish, and one hypothesis is because English is really being sat on. Okay, the question in this study is what would happen if we went on to look at the phonetics of production? And what we found here is we found a different story. We found that the learners who were at a very early stage in the classroom were unable to shut off their English. And so they were showing effects of English on Spanish. And so do you see that there's a cognate effect, both in articulatory duration, and there's a cognate effect in the VOTs. And so what this means is that learners are actually, it's not that surprising, they're speaking Spanish like English. They're fast to produce words that are English-like, and the pronunciation, the phonetics of the pronunciation are much more English-like. But what we see when they're immersed is that effect goes away entirely, and they look more like the proficient speakers. suggesting that, and you see how there's this downward trend in these data. And so what that means is that as you become more proficient, you actually acquire the phonology of Spanish. But it means over and above your ability to acquire the phonology, there's a role that the influence of the native language is playing on the second language production. So we see this cross-language interaction, and here we see it spill over into articulation for these learners at an early stage. Sometimes, in many studies, these cross-language interactions are not seen in behavior. In the data that I just reported, these are behavioral data. This is a study that I just want to mention because it's very, very clever, by Thierry and Wu. It was published in 2007. And it took place in Bangor, Wales, and they tested Chinese-English bilinguals who are immersed in an English-speaking environment. And they asked them to perform, again, a very simple task. They showed them 2 words in English. And what they said is, with those 2 words in English, just decide whether they're semantically related or not. Yes or no. And they had a group of monolingual English speakers perform the task, and then they had this group of Chinese-English bilinguals perform the task. Unbeknownst to the subjects, if you were to translate the words from English into Chinese, the Chinese words actually shared some characters sometime. And what they could do is they could set up a conflict, an implicit conflict, so that sometimes the English words were semantically related, but the Chinese characters were different in the translations, and sometimes they converged. And what they found is I'm not going to go through all the ERP data here, but what they found is in the ERP record, they found evidence for the Chinese English bilinguals, but not for the monolinguals, that the presence of this hidden character similarity changed the way they responded. And so what that suggests is that even though no Chinese was actually present in the experiment, it means that they were implicitly activating their Chinese while they were reading in English. And these are highly, highly proficient students at Bangor University who are, in an English-speaking environment. And so what this suggests is it suggests that that other language is always active and present regardless. There's also evidence in ERP research to show that the ERP record may be exquisitely sensitive to new learning of a second language when behavior doesn't reveal it. This is an example of a study that comes from McLaughlin et al. In 2004 from Lee Osterhout's lab at University of Washington. And what they did here is they looked at people where you would expect, if you want to have a high-risk experiment, which is not something I recommend for graduate students, but if you want to have a high-risk experiment, test people who've had 14 hours of exposure to French and ask how much French they know. Not much. Okay. And you test them behaviorally, and they're in something like a lexical decision task. They're totally a chance. But what happens in the ERP record? The ERP record shows that even after just 14 hours of exposure, they begin to discriminate the French words and non-words from one another. They're beginning to learn the French. Their brains are doing something that their behavior is not reflecting. They're a chance in behavior, but the ERP data suggests something else is going on. So right away what this suggests is that we have to really be tuned in to what we're going to learn from these different measures. There's not going to be one measure that's going to be perfect for everything, and that the 2 languages are going to be percolating along together, and we're going to have to sort out how that interaction occurs and how it gets sorted out. So the second observation, the second discovery. So in that percolation, to use a non-technical term, we see not only that the first language affects the second, but the second comes to affect the first. And if you think about it, and if you're familiar with some of the research on second language acquisition, there's a whole history of what's called transfer effects, particularly for the grammar. There's a lot of research that shows, and it makes perfect sense. You come in with your native language, you're learning a second language, what do? You try to use your old knowledge to guide the learning of the new knowledge. That's absolutely fundamental. I'm not claiming that that's not true. What I'm claiming is that it's more complex, that what we see is that actually there is a bidirectionality here, and we think this bidirectionality may be very important. So what I want to do is I want to report data on two studies that I think reveal these effects of L2 and L1. One of them is a comprehension study, and the second is a production study. And the comprehension study is going to show that these changes begin to occur right away. This is not just a matter of becoming proficient so that your second language is so active that it begins to, permeate the first language, that as soon as you have exposure, you begin to have some changes occur. And then I'll show you some production data that I think provide evidence that not only does the L2 affect the L1, but that the L1 may need to be inhibited during L2 use for the L2 to be proficient. Okay, so the comprehension study, and this is a study that was recently published with my current graduate student, Kinsey Bice. And what we did here is we took a cue from the recent evidence on bilingualism that suggests that bilinguals are not like monolinguals in their native language. We said, what is the role of L1 regulation in L2 learning? And the hypothesis that we've been exploring is the idea that successful second language learners may be people who are able to learn to regulate their native language. There may be something really crucial about allowing, and I don't mean allowing in a conscious sense, but allowing or tolerating the effect of the second language on the first language. And that's how the first language comes to change, and that may be really critical to success. And so what we did here, though, is we were interested in the questions, could we see these effects in the earliest stages of learning? And what we did is we did a lexical decision test. So they simply had to decide, is it a real word in English in this case. They actually did both English and Spanish in this study, but these were native English speakers who were either monolingual or at some level of learning Spanish in the classroom. None of them were particularly proficient. They were either, very, very beginners or kind of intermediate beginners. And we had cognates, which is a tool for looking at the cross-language interactions. And so the question is whether this newly acquired Spanish that these people had just started learning would actually come to influence their English. And what we found is, and I'll show you the data in a second, what we found is that in the EEG data, but not in behavior, we find effects of the L2 on the L1. And what we see is nothing for these are just a little snippet of CZ. So for those of you who don't do ERP research, this is if you have your cap on, CZ is right in the middle of your head. And what we're looking at is the degree of activation that you see here for cognates versus non-cognates for learners. And what we find is that we find larger effects for these intermediate relative to beginning learners, but we even begin to see a small and significant effect for the beginning learners. When we look at the behavioral reaction time data in lexical decision, we see nothing. It's like the Osterhout findings. And again, this is English. This is their L1. And so what we're seeing is that the L2 is coming to affect the L1 almost right away. And there are a number of recent imaging studies that have been published in the literature that converge with this idea, that you begin to see effects in learning right away that reflect the influence in the other direction. So they suggest that this change in the native language may really be crucial as part of the process of becoming proficient, and we have a large-scale study underway now to look more longitudinally at how they change and whether there are individual differences in the degree to which some learners change a lot and some learners only change a little bit in this context. Our ability is that what this really means is that it's going to tell us something about the degree to which individuals are able to regulate their native language during this process. And we think that control of the native language may turn out to really be a crucial piece of the story. Okay, so in production, we see something that also shows that there are effects of the second language on the first. And this is an example, one of the studies we've done using ERPs. This is in production. And again, it's an utterly simple paradigm. We simply ask bilinguals to name pictures, one picture at a time. And even to make it more boring than that, we have them name the pictures in both languages. And we have them name the same pictures in both languages. And the twist in the experiment is that some people, and these are all Chinese English bilinguals who are relatively pretty high proficiency, we have them first name in the L1 and then in the L2, or first name in the L2 and then in the L1. Now, what do you predict if you name the same pictures twice? It should be facilitated, right? Same picture. It's not, and it's not that far apart. You should see repetition priming. You should see some facilitation. In terms of the ERP predictions, the prediction was that we should get some reduced negativity in the ERP data that are consistent with repetition priming type results. And so the question was, would we see this in both languages? Would we see it when we go from L1 to L2 or from L2 to L1? We actually had 4 blocks in the experiment, so they named L1, L1, L2, L2, or L2, L2, L1, L1. Okay? Okay. And what we found was really surprising. Look at the data on the right first. The data on the right are the data for L2. And what we see in the data for L2 is we see exactly what we predicted. And again, this is just CZ, just a little snippet of the data. What you see is that the red line is below the blue line. Okay, the blue line is when the L2 was named first. The red line is when the L2 followed the L1. And so what do you see when you get it the second time? You see priming, you see reduced negativity in the data. The critical result in this experiment is on the left for the L1. And what we see here for L1, we don't see priming. We see a pattern that's more consistent with inhibition. What we see now is the red line is now above the blue line. So when they speak L1, after they've just spoken L2 for a while, they're showing a more negative pattern in the ERP data than when they spoke L1 to begin with. And what we've argued is that we think this pattern suggests that there is inhibition of the L1 that's necessary to enable production of the L2. Now you might think that what would happen is that you'd speak the L1 after you've spoken your L2 and you'd kind of snap back. And everybody has sort of phenomenology. If you've been abroad for a while and you have a moment where you can't grab a hold of your native language, we've published some work on that as well, and there is this sort of moment of panic where you just can't grab the words in your L1 and you think, oh my God, I've really lost it now, I'm ruined for life. And you might think that it would just sort of come back. And in this experiment, we didn't design the experiment to look at how long this is going to last. And what we found was that it lasted the entire experiment. So we actually did potentially, we didn't tell the IRB, but we potentially did ruin these people for a while. We looked after what happened after they had a chance to use L1 again and to recover. And what we found is that we continued, and we only had 4 blocks in the experiment, we continued to find this negative pattern for L1, even when they had a chance to recover. And so now the fact that we use identical pictures means you can't tell you can't localize the source of the inhibition. But what it suggested to us is we've done other experiments, I'll get to some of it later, to try to break apart what may be the different contributors to the inhibition. But what it suggests to us is that the inhibition may be global. That there may be, this isn't just a little bit of just sitting on it to get the next word out and then everything pops back up, that there may be something that's really sitting on your native language, much in the way your phenomenology when you're abroad suggests. And our goal actually is to have a scanner at the airport where people go through customs and immigration and then they go right into the scanner and we look to see, because you have to, and if you, I don't know what your phenomenology is, but mine is that this comes back very quickly. And so your native language within the first 24 hours, first you have this moment of panic and then you think you're aphasic for life and then it comes back. And I don't think we understand very well what that process looks like, but this suggests that there's inhibition of the native language to enable that second language to be produced. We've looked at this in a variety of different, using a variety of measures, and one of the things I want to argue for as well is that in all of this research, it is absolutely crucial to take the approach of using converging methods. There's no one method that's going to give you the answer to every single question here. You have to, if you're asking a temporally sensitive question, you may want to use eye tracking or ERPs. We need to look at the behavioral result and understand the aggregate effect of the behavioral result. We need to use functional and structural imaging to look at the longer term consequences, but we need to determine those methods by what question we're asking. This is an example of exactly the same study. So we took the same materials. This is an undergraduate honor student who went to Japan, who was Japanese, and who tested Japanese-English bilinguals at Penn State and also in Japan. And she just simply had them name pictures, much in the way we had these Chinese-English bilinguals in the ERP study name pictures. And what she did is she first gave them ratings, so language history ratings, to see how they rated their Japanese and English. And what you can see is on a 7-point scale, they rated Japanese as higher than English. Okay, so these are Japanese-English bilinguals living in the US, but they're Japanese dominant. And she gave them a category fluency test, name all the fruits and vegetables, animals, whatever, in each language. And you can see they're producing a lot more in Japanese than they are in English. They're relatively proficient in English. They're living in an English environment, but they're Japanese dominant. Okay, so we then do the same experiment, but we do it behaviorally. And we look at the reaction time to name these pictures. And we either name L1 before L2 or L2 before L1. If you look at the data in this graph, this is just reaction time, mean picture naming latency. The data on the left are data when you name L1 first. So they're naming Japanese, naming pictures in Japanese, and then naming pictures in English. And do you see how the black bar is faster than the red bar? That's what you'd expect. These people are Japanese dominant. They're faster to name pictures in Japanese. Nothing to write home about. It's not that exciting. It's exactly what you'd predict. The exciting result is on the right. This is what happens when the people name in L2 first. They name in English first, and then they name in Japanese. And two things need to be noted. First, do you see how much slower they are? And do you see that they're actually slower now? These are Japanese dominant bilinguals. They are slower to speak Japanese if they've just spoken English. It's exactly like the ERP result. So what we're finding is that there is inhibition of the native language if you've just spoken the second language. And so it's actually a reversal of their normal language dominance in this environment. We've done this with articulatory duration as well, where we do the same kind of experiment, and then we look to see what the word duration is in naming a picture if you've just spoken the L2 and then you have to switch to the L1. And what we find is that you have longer articulatory duration following L2 than preceding L2. And in this particular experiment, there was actually a repetition of tokens. We were working with a phonologist who was obsessive about having the same tokens. And so we did the phonetics on this. We had exactly the same onset. We don't have to worry about other confounding issues. And in fact, they're slower, not faster, and they should be faster if there was priming on this. So again, there is pervasive evidence that there is inhibition of the L1. Now these effects I've been telling you about are all lexical. And you might really wonder, so yeah, I'm arguing the native language is not the Rock of Gibraltar. And you might wonder though, you might say, okay, these are all very nice lexical demonstrations, but language is not just words. And we need to really pay attention to the fact that we need to ask this question at other levels. And I just want to mention in this talk that there is a lot of evidence that we see these effects at the level of the grammar. There are many, many different studies now that have shown these interactions. And this is an example from my colleague, Julie Ducius at Penn State, who has asked the question of how the structural commitments of one language influence the processing of the other language. And so she's looked at relative clause attachment in sentence processing with sentences like, Peter fell in love with the daughter of a psychologist who studied in California. So you ask the question, who studied in California? If you're a native English speaker, you tend to say it was a psychologist. If you're a native Spanish speaker and you were presented this sentence in Spanish, you would say it was a daughter, because you attach high rather than low. And that's the difference between the preferences, structural, grammatical preferences in the two languages. Here's what she found. If she tested native Spanish speakers who were immersed in English, but who had not attrited in, there was no attrition in their Spanish. They were actively using Spanish. They begin to parse Spanish like English. They begin to prefer low attachment in Spanish. So it's not just learning the preference in the L2, which is English for them. It's that they begin to use the L2 preference in processing English, okay, which is really a dramatic effect. And she's recently done she's done a lot of studies on this topic and looked at it using eye tracking. She's done some training studies now showing that you can train this in the laboratory in the shorter term as well. So it's very clear that the usage base in the environment has a huge effect on how the grammar gets used. Now, we can't generalize from these results to every single grammatical structure, but what we can say is that there appears to be an openness in the grammar that was not the assumption in most of the traditional research, certainly on monolingual sentence processing. Okay, so the evidence here suggests that there's a change that happens from the L2 to L1. That change may in fact be a change that reflects a process of acquiring regulation or inhibition of the native language to be able to incorporate the second language into the language system. And there's been an argument that these inhibitory control effects really involve different brain networks that are engaged to solve particular types of language processing problems. And a focus in the recent research has really been to try to understand how these effects of bilingualism and language experience change the brain, both structurally and functionally. There's a model that was proposed by Judith Kroll and David Green almost 10 years ago, really trying to identify some key areas of the brain that were hypothesized to be involved in making this kind of selection between the two languages, and that might be thought to be engaged. We did a fMRI version of the inhibitory control study that I described, the ERP study that I described a moment ago, where we looked at the effect of naming an L1 after naming an L2 or vice versa, and then comparing that to naming pictures in a mixed language environment. And the question, just to sort of jump to the conclusion here, is that what we find that different areas of the brain are active when you look at the inhibitory effect imposed by switching from L2 to L1 versus mixing the two languages. And so what it suggests is that there are multiple components of inhibitory control. Some of them may operate locally. Some of them may have to do with inhibiting yourself from saying a particular word. Others may operate more globally, may have to do with really sitting on the entire language. There may be some that are more semantically mediated. We're doing some studies now to look at whether or not there can be semantic control of one language versus the other. You get ready to name all the animals in Spanish and the fruits and vegetables in English and see whether you can use that as a cue to keep things separate. But what it suggests is that there's really overwhelming evidence at every level that there are distinct patterns of activation, and that I think it's premature to argue what's local and what's global, but I think that we're beginning to see that there may be multiple contributions to these phenomena. They're not a single thing. Okay, so being bilingual is not only about acquiring L2. It's this native language may really take a hit. And one of the things we really want to understand is how that change to the native language plays out, not only for proficient bilinguals who seem to have internalized this process, but for learners who may face this as a crucial hurdle in becoming proficient in a second language. So the argument I want to make is that really bilinguals have to learn to regulate the L1. And the native language may be as or more interesting in this story than what we know about the second language. So, and we see these effects at every level, and one of the questions we can ask, and the question that people have started to ask, is a fMRI study asking, if you're bilingual over the long haul, does it change your brain? I mean, so do you see these changes that it persist. And there's evidence that suggests that we're beginning to see effects that seem like they are the long-term consequences of being bilingual. The bilingual brains don't look like monolingual brains. I'm going to go into more detail later. Okay, I want to talk for the remaining time that I have on the consequences of bilingualism. And in many ways, this is really the juiciest topic these days, to really consider all of this. It's, you know, what's producing these consequences that we see that seem to go beyond language itself. And the claim initially was that all of this parallel activation, or the addition of one language to use the other language, was really creating this kind of juggling act that suggesting, and that juggling act tunes networks that enable control and build cognitive reserve. But what we've come to see recently is that it's a little more complicated. If you read the paper, even one that's in your state, there's a lot of press about bilingualism. And bilingualism is good for you, bilingualism is good for the brain, the tip of the tongue. I am the person who is responsible for the phrase is like a mental gymnasium, and I swear to God I did not say that to the reporter. And that's what appeared in the piece. But the idea is not so far-fetched. I mean, the idea is that maybe what all this does is to exercise the brain in a way that we can think of as being similar to physical exercise. So if you have you're really fit, and you then get some kind of injury, you may be able to better recover from that injury than someone who's not fit. So maybe you have a kind of mental tuning that occurs. And this hypothesis for a very long time was really the way people had thought about these consequences of bilingualism. So bilinguals really become expert jugglers, and if you're an expert juggler, then you're going to be expert, it's going to spill over into everything else you do. So whenever you're presented with some kind of conflict, you're going to be better able to negotiate it than monolingual might, better able to, better able to switch between tasks, better able to ignore irrelevant information. And so that was really basically the story. And the problem with the story is that it just can't be that simple. And we think, in particular, we think that this issue about how the native language is regulated may really be crucial. But the question is really how to think about the complications. These are some data by Jubin Abutalebi and colleagues, which is an fMRI study where they had people perform a flanker task, so a typical executive function task, while they were being scanned. And what they found, and the critical result here is, I don't know if you can see this from where you're sitting, but you can see that there's a lot more activation for the monolinguals than for the bilinguals. And the claim is that the monolinguals are acting less skilled at resolving competition. And what they see is they see particular anterior cingulate cortex difference between the bilinguals and the monolinguals. And the claim they're making is that this area of the brain that's been implicated in conflict resolution is being tuned by the experience of being bilingual. And that what you see over time is you see that it's not that the bilinguals are using a different area of the brain to solve the problem, it's that they can do it more efficiently. And that's the kind of neural data that suggests that these experiences over time may produce changes in efficiency. But there's also some data, also using fMRI, that suggests that we don't always see the results so robustly for young adults. This is a study by Gold and colleagues in 2013, where they didn't use flanker, they used a switching task, a non-linguistic switching task. And what they basically found is they also found involvement of the ACC, but what they found is they found that an advantage for older bilinguals relative to older monolinguals, they found nothing for the young adult bilinguals. They found the young adult bilinguals in behavior and in the brain were very similar. The older adults showed an effect. And so the data are beginning to suggest, and not just this study, but many other studies, that maybe there's something different about what happens in old age and what happens for young adult bilinguals. And if you've read, there's a horrific piece in the Atlantic, which I shouldn't even tell you about, but I will. And this was in Scientific American recently, and you say, debate rages. I mean, people use words like mythology. Are these effects of bilingualism just a big myth? Is it all just really something someone made up one night, trying to invent a good story? And so there's been there's been a lot of debate about this, and really their failures to replicate. And we all have to take these failures to replicate seriously. So there's failures to replicate some of these executive function advantages for young adult bilinguals. In the child literature, there's some evidence that there is some failure to replicate the effects for young bilingual children. Some people have argued maybe it's really just demographics. Whenever you compare bilinguals and monolinguals, you're comparing two different groups of people who are necessarily different from one another. Maybe the bilinguals are, eating better dinner at night. Maybe they're better educated. Maybe they have some other perks that the monolinguals don't have. So we have to really pay attention to all of these issues. And people have, and my reading of the literature is that you do see effects of bilingualism when you take these other things into account. But the other message in the sort of, sitting back and saying, this is more complicated, it comes to this Costa study in 2009 said, we see these effects of executive function for young adult bilinguals, but only when the task is really hard. So when we give people an easy task, we don't really see monolinguals and bilinguals are all fine. When we up the ante a little bit, suddenly this bilingual advantage begins to emerge. So bilingualism has diverse consequences over the lifespan. And I want to argue that to understand those consequences, we really need to understand how they use language. And the critiques on the consequences have largely reported correlational data. Bilinguals versus monolinguals, you see a difference, but they haven't really examined the language processes directly. And so we don't really know which aspects of language processing contribute to the consequences that have been observed. So I want to, in the very final 10 minutes that I have, try to cover a set of points that I think begin to speak to this issue. So I've shown you some data on efficiency that suggests that bilinguals may be more efficient than monolinguals in solving some of these problems. Sometimes these effects are only observable in brain data, not in behavior. Sometimes they're in structural or functional data, but not in both. So there's unclear, but certainly evidence that is emerging. And I'll point out that in none of these studies are bilinguals ever disadvantaged. So when we see differences, it's that bilinguals are advantaged relative to monolinguals. When we see, or we see no effect, there's very, very little data to suggest that bilinguals are disadvantaged. As I said a moment ago, the consequences may be more evident for older bilinguals than for younger, and there's some evidence that bilingualism provides protection against cognitive decline. I'll mention that in just a moment. But these are not simple effects. They are complex, and I think that we have to be very careful about using the word advantage, because in fact it may be that there are consequences of bilingualism, some of which may produce advantages or facilitation of some sort, and some of which may not. And critically, that not all bilinguals are the same. Not all monolinguals are the same. And in fact, we have to be very careful about how we characterize who we're talking about and what they do with language. So just to very quickly mention some of these results for older bilinguals, and some of the results that are really most provocative in the literature. So Bialystock and colleagues in 2005 showed that healthy older adults seem to outperform monolinguals on executive function tests behaviorally. And then went on to show that there appeared to be a 4 to 5 year delay in the onset of Alzheimer's type symptoms in bilinguals who were then going to go on and develop Alzheimer's. So bilingualism does not protect you against Alzheimer's, be clear about that. What it protects against are the symptoms of Alzheimer's. So it's as if bilinguals are able to compensate for the symptoms because they have this tuned control system. The study was criticized. People said, well, how do we know it's not just that these, well-to-do, educated Toronto bilinguals are simply, showing these benefits. And then in 2013, Sirvana Alati and colleagues published a very important study from India with a group of, I think, 600 dementia patients, showing that a group who were uneducated and illiterate showed the same 4 to 5 year advantage on the basis of their bilingualism. And there's also been a replication in Belgium showing the very same effect. So the point is that it's not that the demographics don't affect executive function, that there are effects of other variables. The point is that over and above that, we see an effect of bilingualism. And this Schweitzer result, Ellen Bialystok calls this a one-question intelligence test. See if you can get it. At the point of diagnosis with Alzheimer's, the bilinguals have more diseased brains. Because bilingualism doesn't affect the area of the brain where Alzheimer's develops. It's affecting the control mechanisms. And so what you have is at the point where they're actually showing up and being diagnosed, they're already much farther gone than the monolinguals when they're being diagnosed. So, and there was a recent study, this is Sirvana Alati in India, very exciting study published in November last year, showing that you see similar kinds of benefits in stroke patients for cognitive recovery following stroke, and that bilingualism seems to confer this kind of benefit. And again, these are not simple phenomena. This is a study by Tamar Golan and her colleagues in San Diego, and they claim that you can see effects for low education bilinguals here, but not high education bilinguals in their sample. So again, it depends on who the bilinguals are, the nature of their bilingual experience, and you're not going to get exactly a cookie cutter result that's going to be identical across all these different groups. Okay, a second point about complexity is that these regulatory processes, in much of the discussion and debate about bilingualism, people wanted to have, like a litmus test, right? You take it, you put it in, it turns color, and you say, bilinguals are better than monolinguals. We'll show that 50 times, and we're all in business, and that's it. Well, it turns out that there are many studies that don't show an overall difference between bilinguals and monolinguals overall, but do show differences in the subtle interaction between the way these tests are coordinated. This is a study by Julio Morales in Granada, Spain, using the AXCPT test that some of you may be familiar with. That is a measure of executive function that separates proactive and reactive processes. I'm not going to go through the specifics of it yet, but it's about generating predictions for what's coming up, and whether you can effectively generate the prediction, and whether you can then hold back if your prediction is wrong, and not make the wrong response. And what she showed is that it was a matter of coordination. What she showed is that she gave her bilinguals and monolinguals this AXCPT test, and she also gave them a stop signal test, where you have to try to stop as quickly as possible. Overall, there was no difference between the bilinguals and monolinguals in the stop signal test. The difference was that for the bilinguals, but not for the monolinguals, there was a modulation of performance that was predicted by their executive control function. And so the claim is that there may be some subtle coordination that occurs across these different components of executive function, and that we need to not be asking main effect questions, we need to be asking interaction questions. And we need to think about, given the host of variables that may be important, this becomes quite complex. Okay, not all bilingual experience produces the same consequence. There's been some very exciting work by David Green and Jubin Abitalevi, something called the adaptive control hypothesis. The paper is not really, it's a sketch is how I would describe it. The claim they're making is that bilinguals do different things with languages. And let's take one example. You can have two bilinguals who are equally proficient. One might code switch, go back and forth between the two languages. The other doesn't. That might have an effect. But critically, you can have two bilinguals, equally proficient, both code switch. But it turns out one lives in an environment where everybody code switches in the same way with the same languages. The other lives in an environment where only some people code switch. So the one in the more diverse environment is constantly making decisions about who they should speak which language with. The one in the other environment can just let it flow. Okay. Should that have an effect on control? Of course it should. Has it been studied? I mean, for the most part, no. And so the hypothesis is that we really need to understand how the languages are used, whether some bilinguals have the two languages very separate, others use them in a much more mixed environment. We need to understand all of that. And I'm going to try to finish up with one more study, if I can squeeze it in, that tries to illustrate this. In 1989, Francois Grosjean, who's really a sort of pioneer in this area of research on bilingualism, published a very highly cited paper called, it's sort of a belligerent title, Neurolinguists Beware, the bilingual is not two monolinguals in one. And what we know in 2016 is he was right, not for the right reasons necessarily, but he was right. And the reason, what this paper was in, it was an angry paper. And what it was about is he was criticizing basically neurolinguists for arguing that when you saw language switching in patients, that it was an indication of pathology. And people have argued that for children as well, that language switching is pathology. Your mouth is open, but that's how it was thought about, that if people switched between languages, there was something wrong with their brain. And in fact, what we now know is that not only is code switching not pathology, but in fact may be the critical factor that determines whether or not you see these cognitive benefits. But the question still is how. And I want to tell you about a study that we've just published. This is with postdoc Melinda Fricke, working with me and with Julie Ducius at Penn State. Melinda came to us from Berkeley, another UC person, as a phonologist, and was really interested in looking at the phonetics of bilingual speech. And so here's what we did. We had the idea that when bilinguals code switch, they have to pay really careful attention to one another. They really have to be in alignment with one another, and we need to think about how that alignment occurs. So what we did is we did a study that had two parts, and I'm only going to briefly describe this today. First, we used corpus data. We said, what if we look at naturalistic code switching? We look at instances of code switching, and this was in the Duggar et al. 2014 Bangor corpus. And we looked at code switching, and the paper describes in gory detail how we extracted these examples. We focused on code switching within a sentence from the dominant language of the conversation into the other language. And this was totally two people, Spanish-English bilinguals in Miami were left in a room. They could just talk to each other. There was no constraint on what they could talk about. They could talk about anything they liked. And what we then do here is on the extracted sample, we look at the syllable duration as a function of the preceding language. And what we find is that their speech rate slows down prior to a code switch. Okay, so there's evidence in this naturalistic data that they are anticipating a switch coming up, that they're going to make a switch. And we then look at these phonetic changes that occur and ask, do they occur prior to a code switch or following a switch? And what we find is that they are entirely anticipatory. They're not perseverative. We find that the changes are occurring prior to a switch. English consonants become more Spanish-like. And then we find following the switch, there's really no evidence of cross-language influence. Okay, so that's interesting in and of itself. But here's the crucial question. Can bilingual listeners exploit this phonetic information? And so what we then did, and I don't have time today to present these data in gory detail, we did a visual world study. And what we did is we doctored the input that they heard. And the question is, when those cues were present, and this was a totally independent sample, so this is a laboratory study using this, using what we learned from the corpus study to design the materials. And what we found is that habitual code switchers, these were Spanish-English bilinguals at Penn State, were able to perceive and exploit the phonetic cues that led up to a code switch. And so what's really exciting about this to us is that this suggests that code switching bilinguals have learned to dance. They've learned to dance with one another. And so in thinking about these consequences of bilingualism, we want to argue, and we don't know, we didn't do the cognitive consequences in this study. We want to know how this kind of coordination, dancing, alignment, tuning, whatever you want to call it, is actually responsible for some of what we see when we see these consequences. It's very clear that there's a very tight coupling between what speakers are doing and what listeners are able to exploit. And we think this is really exciting. So, just to finish up, there's much that we don't know. Among the goals for the next stage of research, we need an adequate characterization of bilingualism, multilingualism. We need to know how bilingual a person has to be. Bilingualism is not a categorical variable, despite the way it's been treated in the literature. We need to understand something about the role of context and availability or support or lack of support. What does it mean to be bilingual in a place where you speak a minority language that's not particularly supported by the culture versus speak two languages that are? We need to understand something about what age of acquisition really means in this context, and whether the answer to that question is the same for all the different language tasks that a bilingual performs. We need to pay attention to monolinguals. Not all monolinguals are the same. Recent studies of monolingual processing have shown that even native speakers of the same language differ in their proficiency in processing that language. We need an account of the consequences of bilingualism not only for executive function, but we also need an account for new learning. And the recent literature is beginning to examine those consequences. Bilinguals tend to be better learners than monolinguals. We are now investigating whether that's very domain specific, whether it's really for language, or whether it's learning in general, and whether it may be that if you're an early bilingual, that you have some openness in your system, in the way the system has been tuned, that prepares you for new learning throughout the lifespan in a very different way. We need to understand the implications of the findings with bilingual babies and or bilingually exposed babies. I haven't mentioned anything about babies. There's fantastic research showing that babies who are in a bilingual environment change their attentional trajectory, their development in a very, very clear way. It doesn't confuse them, contrary to mythology. In fact, they benefit from it, and they become very good at tuning into just the right cues and right information. We don't yet understand what that long-term consequence might be. So to end, the bilingual may in fact be a mental juggler, but the science of how experience changes the brain and behavior is really only beginning to identify the factors that may be required to provide what I would consider to be a comprehensive account of bilingualism and its consequences. The message is not that things are complex, they are. And we don't often like it when things are complex. We want to have, it's more satisfying to know it's one thing. This is not one thing. We need to accept that and really begin to try to identify the agenda that's going to systematically identify what the critical factors may be. But I want to argue that research on bilingualism, I think, holds enormous promise for revealing general principles of cognition and its neural basis. We would know none of this if we studied monolinguals alone. And the implications are not just for our interest and curiosity, despite how interesting they may be. They really require a revision of traditional stories of language development, about cognitive control, and about the plasticity associated with language experience. Thank you.